In this video, we change everything. What's going on, everybody? Today we've got the Element Enduro back on the bench, and we're going to run through some changes on this thing. Now, right in the box, this vehicle came with the optional overdrive gears, and we're going to get those installed. But in addition to that, the guys from Element gave me a bunch of their option plastic parts. And these option parts are just the same design as what you see on the truck. They're still plastic, but they're made in their more rigid plastic, basically. So this is something that Associated's done for a long time in the race buggy scene, but this is the first time I've seen it done in the scale market like this. So I've got a number of items here, including knuckles and C-hubs, the external rock sliders. I've got shock towers all the way around. I also have a new skid plate, a servo mount. We've got the battery brace and the rear cross brace. And then I also have the slider bases and receiver box. And while we're in there doing all of these things, I'm also going to go ahead and change out that shorty battery box to a full-size battery box. That battery box was included in the kit, so we're going to use that. I just don't have packs that fit in that shorty battery tray that are 3S that I would want to run. I looked at getting some other ones, but there just wasn't a lot available. So I'm gonna go to the full-size pack option. And yesterday in the mail, actually, the guys from Element sent me one of the Reedy 3S 4500 packs, probably because of all the complaining I did about running 2S in the initial video. After we get all of those things done, I've got two other things to install. One is the Reedy 16-turn rebuildable motor. Now, this vehicle comes with a 16-turn, but just a regular sealed can. Now, these are a 5-slot motor, so that 16-turn actually refers to more closely to like a 27 to 35-turn motor, somewhere in there. I've loved running 5-slot motors for years. They've been my preference for a really long time, and it's cool to see something come ready to run like this. So I am going to swap in this 5-slot as well as a Reedy servo that they sent. This is the RC2312 servo. I've never ran one of the Reedy servos, and the stock ready to run servo in this is actually one of the better ready to run servos I've ran. So I'm not changing this out because I was unhappy with this, but I always want more power out of a servo anyway, so we'll give this one a shot. And to top all of that off, I also picked up one of the Proline back half cages, and I'm going to try and adapt this to this Enduro body, and I think I might try and use the bed sides as well. The first thing I want to do is I want to get this transmission taken care of. I want to swap in the overdrive and install the new motor. I'm going to remove the 4 screws from the bottom. I'm going to remove the 2 screws holding the spur gear cover on. I'm going to remove the motor now as well. The spur and pinion on this are actually both 48 pitch, which probably accounts for a little bit of why this truck is so quiet. I'm going to remove the front and rear drive shafts. And I'm going to remove the 5 screws holding the 2 transmission halves together. Now, with the back side of the transmission housing removed, we can see the gears on the inside. I guess you could call this actually the front half, since this is the side that actually has the front output on it. What we need to do is we need to take these last 2 gears out of the transmission, and that's what we're going to swap with the included gears that came inside as well. The final gear just pulls out like this. You'll see that there's a bearing and a spacer that kind of ride on that pin between the 2 final gears. Then we also need to remove this idler gear. We'll remove the first bearing. And that gear just pulls off. Make sure that the pin is still in position so that we can put that new gear on. There's 4 screws holding this output onto that final gear, and we need to remove those. With the 4 screws removed from the output, you'll notice that the output and the gear separate easily. There is another bearing on the inside of that output. Make sure that that bearing stays in place. Now we're going to take the new gear that came in the box and attach it to that output. With the gear attached to the output, I'm going to apply a small amount of grease to the plastic gears. Now I'm going to reinstall, making sure that the spacer and the other bearing are still on the shaft of this transmission. Now, before reinstalling the idler gear, I need to replace that pin because it fell out. And now with the pin in place, I'm going to drop in that new idler gear. Everything drops in place. And now we've got a 11 or 12% overdrive rather than the stock 6%. Make sure after installing the idler gear that you replace the bearing on the end, or make sure that it's still in the transmission case. Now we'll reinstall the 5 screws holding the 2 transmission halves together. Now, rather than reinstalling the stock motor, I'm going to reinstall the rebuildable Reedy 16 turn. We do need to swap over the pinion from the stock motor onto this one first. So I've got the new 16 turn motor onto the motor plate, and now I've got to set my gear mesh. It's been a long time since I set 48 pitch gear mesh. Then lastly, we'll reinstall the spur gear cover. Rather than reinstalling this into the chassis, we're going to set it aside because we're going to swap out some of the plastics that it bolts to. At this point, we just kind of need to pick a place to start and go for it. I'm going to start in the front and try and work towards the rear, and then we'll come back to the axles. But let's get everything stripped out of this chassis. The stock servo uses a plastic servo horn and is held into the chassis braces with a regular button head and a washer. We're going to change out the servo horn, and I'm going to put in the washer head screws from Incision. Now in this pile of parts here, they did send me a new receiver box as well, and I'm going to change out the receiver to my Futaba. But I had to open this up anyway because I actually need the little rubber gaskets that are installed in this one. Before I just completely strip the entire car, I want to try and get at least the front portion back together. The new chassis plastics are a dark gray versus the black, so you can see a clear difference in the appearance of the parts. The servo installs into the front brace from the bottom, and like I said, I'm going to replace the button head screws and washers with these washer head screws from Incision. With the servo on the brace, I'm going to put this back into the chassis. Just to make sure that I can actually remove the skid plate, I'm only going to reattach one side of the shock towers. Shock towers come in a parts tree like this. That front servo brace is only held in by the screws that attach the shock towers. I'm going to remove the body posts and note the position just to make sure that I can get them back in the exact same spot. Now I'm going to remove the slider bases and outer rock sliders. So I've got the sliders completely removed, the upper links are detached. Now I just need to remove the lower link screws so that I can pull the old skid plate out and put the new one in. Again, you can note the color difference between the black stock one and the gray replacement. Grab our slider bases and use those to get everything reattached. We got all the front suspension links reinstalled. Now just having to go through, attach the rear suspension links and all the extra screws that hold these slider bases to this skid plate. Now that we've got all the suspension links back installed and this chassis's got some of its rigidity back, I'm going to finish up the front suspension by replacing that other shock tower, and we need to put in the new front cross brace. This is the factory battery tray mount. This is the new hard plastic version. So basically we have the whole front half of the chassis replaced other than the front bumper support. That one I did not get. I don't know if they make that or if they just forgot to give it to me. Either way, that one is not getting replaced in this video. Now we're going to go to the rear part of the chassis, replace these shock towers, this cross brace, and then we're going to do one other thing. In the rear, when you're installing the new shock towers, make sure you know that there's 3 sets of holes. The stock wheelbase configuration is the furthest most rearward. You need to remove that rear cross brace and grab our new hard plastic version. Also, before attaching the 2 sides of this chassis, I'm going to take the old front cross brace that held the battery and I'm going to install it in the back side of the chassis here, just behind the transmission. This chassis has a little too much torsional flex for my liking, and I think this is going to help, and I was told that it will bolt in place here very easily. So we're going to need 4 M3x6 screws to hold that in place, I believe, and I think that's going to make a big difference here in the back half of the chassis. So we're going to put the 4 screws to attach this rear cross brace in. I only have stainless here handy, so we're going to use 4 M3x6 stainless screws. Very simple piece to add, but I think that honestly will make a good bit of difference. At this time, I'm going to take and swap out that shorty for the full-size battery tray. Then we need to reinstall our Velcro battery straps. Now, before putting the transmission back in and replacing the receiver box and all that, I am going to take apart the front axle housing and replace the C-hubs and knuckles with the included hard plastic pieces. Something else to note is that the hexes on this are plastic, so down the road you may want to look at upgrading those to aluminum. We need to unscrew the aluminum high steer arm from the plastic knuckle to transfer that over. The installation of the hard plastic parts is just like any normal axle. These should be really straightforward for you guys. Just remove the parts, keep track of your screws, and replace everything exactly as you pulled it out. When reinstalling the front end, one very important thing to note is that you need to have your caster basically straight up and down. Otherwise, that BTA link, the behind the axle steering link, will not clear either the pinion shaft or your upper links. So make sure you get that set, make sure you pay attention to that, otherwise you'll have rubbing and definitely cause issues. So now I've got all the parts in the front axle replaced, the chassis is in good shape. I want to get the servo set up so I can reattach the steering link. I'm going to use my little servo controller to center the servo. To use this, I'll plug in a receiver pack to the power side. I'll put it to the middle selection, which is neutral, and then I just plug the servo into it. So now the servo will be centered, and I can install my Vanquish Products 25 tooth, 20 millimeter long servo horn. After getting the servo horn installed and the drag link hooked up to it, I'm gonna go to the manual mode on here, and now I can just double check that I'm getting full throw in both directions. And I easily do. So now I can disconnect the programmer. And one issue that I found with this servo is that this thing the servo lead is not long enough to get into the receiver box that would be here. So for now, I'm just going to install my receiver onto the rock slider base rather than putting the receiver box back in. I don't really go in that much water anyway, so I'm not super concerned. I'm going to be using a Futaba 2106GF receiver. So now at this time, we're going to reinstall the transmission. The spur gear cover on this points towards the rear of the vehicle in the stock configuration. There's two extruded aluminum sliders. The longer one is for the rear drive shaft. With the transmission in place, we can now replace the 4 screws that hold it into the chassis. So at this point, I've got everything put back together. I put my receiver over on this rock slider base, just double-sided tape it on there. Again, later on down the road, maybe I'll pick up a small servo extension, put that waterproof receiver box back in place, but for now, I'm not too worried about it. I got the ESC reinstalled on the other slider base. We've got the new motor in, the optional overdrive installed. The full-size battery pack is in here on the new full-size battery plate that comes with it. We've got the Reedy servo installed with the Vanquish servo horn, and then we've got the hard plastic installed everywhere. Now, one of the things that I haven't installed yet are the actual outside rock sliders, and we're gonna do that, but I'm gonna get the body put back on here first so I can really get those placed where I want, because I think I want to bring them in further than the stock ones were installed. But before we put the body on here, we're gonna take that Pro Line back half cage and we're gonna install it onto that Sendero body. I beat this body up pretty good at Pro Line by the Fire. I am getting some tearing down here by the corners where the rock sliders go. You know, there's a lot of stress where that is. The 2-piece body allows things to move around a little bit more than a 1-piece body does. While it looks really good, there are some other side effects. But this body admittedly is a little bit thin down here at the bottom as well. So what we're gonna do is I'm gonna unbolt the 2 pieces of the body and I'm going to assemble this Pro Line cage. Now, I'm not gonna let the bed go too far because we are gonna look at that before the end here. But here's that Pro Line back half cage. This is part number 6322-00. This is the first time I've actually put together one of these cages, so we're gonna see how that goes as well. One thing to note is there are no instructions for this cage in the bag. I don't know if they're online or if they just expect you to kind of figure it out. I know which way I'm gonna go. This cage is a very rubbery plastic. This top cap uses hardware with an 050 head to it, which is awfully tiny. Before you put the top cap on, it looks like you need to put the rear lower cradle on. After putting that lower cradle on, then we're gonna install all of the screws that hold this top cap on. These are very tiny and likely should be done by hand, but we're just gonna try and be careful with a power driver. Now that we have the lower cradle attached and that rear cap on, we're gonna start the installation of the rear down bar portion. There's this little accessory rack portion that can bolt into the inside of the cage here. For me, I'm gonna leave this part out. I'm not really looking to add a bunch of things to the inside of this cage, so I'm just gonna put that aside, but just know that it is an option that comes with the cage. Now this portion of the cage bolts to the rest of the roll cage, but the screws are meant to go through the body, then through this, and then screw into that rear cage. So I'm gonna use this piece as a stencil or a guide to find where I'm going to mount this to this body. For the sake of realism, I'm going to make sure that these rear upper corners don't go through the rear window of the body. So I'm gonna put it right above that and mark my holes. And now we can take and put this whole assembly together in the cab. We're gonna make sure to use the included washers on the inside of the body just to make sure things don't pull through too easily. The top cab corner screws are always the hardest to get to. I have an old 2.5 ball end that makes that a little bit easier. After getting those top cab corners done, the rest of this should go pretty quickly. Rear cage bolts on there nice, looks good, and I think will actually help this body be a little bit more rigid. So now let's mock this up on the chassis and see what modifications we need to make there. So the number one thing we need to do is get this thing out of here, which is definitely probably one of my favorite parts about using this cage, is getting rid of these bumpers. This rear bumper is bad, the front bumper is worse, and we'll take care of that front bumper at a later date, but getting rid of one of them is a small enough victory. The rear cage sits right on top of these frame rails, and looking front to rear, the body's actually sitting level against the slider, so this is pretty much the perfect location. The one thing I need to do is I need to raise these rear body posts so that we can cut new holes in the top side of this fuel cell on this Proline cage. So I'm actually just kind of eyeballing down, and there's a grid pattern on the inside of this fuel cell on the cage, and I can kind of see what row it lines up with, which is basically right in the first grid. And then I'm just going to measure between the posts and split that difference on, this is that grid on the inside, and I can tell that looking straight down I'm basically lining up in this first grid. So I'm just going to measure between these two posts and then match that measurement here and drill 2 new holes. So we're in like that 72 to 73 millimeter range, which puts us really close to just right on these outside lines. We're gonna call that pretty close. I'm just gonna assume my hole's in the right spot, and we're gonna go right for the 1/4 inch bit to drill our new body holes. Clean up the back side of the hole with the hobby knife. Now let's reinstall those body posts. I'm just gonna put them at the tallest position because they're fairly short, and we'll see how close we are. And nice. Actually, this body feels so much better on there. That it's just more rigid in general. It doesn't have that rattling sound it had. I'm so much happier with this. Now, one thing I did want to look at is I wanted to take and see what it would take to actually cut out the center of this bed and place it back over this new Proline rear back half cage. So let's cut this thing up. So I got pretty out of hand with the body, but this is the fender that I ended up with. I cut the entire tailgate out, cut the entire inside of the bedside out, and what I left was just a tab in the front that I can utilize the stock mounting holes for. And what I've found is that this is going to work out pretty well. We're going to be able to tuck this in right behind that Proline cage. I can line it up with the existing body holes so that my body lines are going to match up. And I'll be able to bring this in just a little bit for a slightly pinched look in the back, and I'm gonna attach it to that Proline cage. I think in the end, this will give me that pre-runner type look, and I'm super stoked with the direction this is going. So now I need to just cut the other side to match this side. So we've got everything buttoned up. I did mount those new hard plastic sliders. I moved them in 1 notch compared to stock. We've got the hard plastics on everywhere else in the chassis. Not something I necessarily thought I needed to do, but I had them, I might as well install them, and being able to add that second brace to the rear half of the chassis I think is going to be a big help. But then of course adding the Proline back half cage I think was the biggest thing that we did tonight. That looks pretty good. I'm happy with adding the bedsides back to it. I think it just kind of makes this look a little bit more complete, and you can't necessarily see under the bed as much as you can with these Proline cages if you don't have something like this. So I think it's a win-win. I like the no tailgate, pre-runner look. I don't really like to run spare tires. This cage is definitely made for that type of situation, but I'm probably gonna try and get away from that. I don't know if there's something I can put back here or not. There's already a fuel cell, and I'm not much for adding sleeping bags and bed rolls, so I'll have to think of something else. I may come up with some sort of 3D printed mount to really lock the sides of this body in place a little bit better. Right now I drilled a very small hole on each side and put a little zip tie on it, and that holds it in exactly where I want it. I'm actually happy with the look overall, but long term that's probably not the most secure way, it will probably tear that Lexan eventually. But the other thing I did is I cut off the bottom side of the bed. It had a notch for the rear bumper, so I just cut it at the top level of that notch. And getting rid of that rear bumper, huge improvement. That thing was definitely a road grader, and we still have the plow on the front, but we'll take care of that at a later date. I've got my Futaba radio in there now. I've got the rebuildable 16-turn motor, a stronger servo, 3S LiPo pack. Should be a whole different truck to drive compared to when I drove it the first time. And of course, the increased overdrive percentage. Forgot we did that too. We really got a lot done tonight. I almost tore down the entire truck to do what we did, so no small task. As you guys have probably already seen and probably noticed in the previous videos, I already changed out the wheels to some Vanquish Method 101s with 350 hubs all the way around. So if you didn't notice that, or I just hadn't said anything about it, obviously those are new beadlock wheels that I did not touch on before. But that's gonna do it for this video, guys. We've still got a lot that we can do to this truck, and I'm looking forward to doing some of that. But if you guys have anything else you would like to see, absolutely comment with it below. Appreciate you guys for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoy these videos. Subscribe if you're not already. Hit the notification bell so you see the videos as soon as they get uploaded. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.